All right. Hello, everyone. As you're filing in, let us get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Carol Liao, and I want to welcome you all to this virtual event celebrating the book launch of From Ideas to Action, Governance Past Net Zero by Dr. Janis Sarra. I am grateful to be joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations as we gather virtually today to discuss this very important book. This event is co-hosted by the Peter P. Dillon Center for Business Ethics at the UBC Sauder School of Business and the Center for Business Law and Center for Feminist Legal Studies at the UBC Faculty of Law. It is also supported by the Canada Climate Law Initiative, which is generously funded by the Mccall Foundation, the Ivy Foundation, the North Family Foundation, Jaroslawski Foundation, and the Trottier Foundation under the auspices of the Clean Energy Fund. We thank these centers and foundations for their ongoing support. And I'd like to kick off this book launch by introducing our spectacular moderator, Catherine Mccall, the Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance, which represents over 53 major institutional investors in Canada. Catherine, we're so honored to have you to moderate this session today, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. That's very kind. I'm delighted to be here to help celebrate the release of Professor Sarra's remarkable and much needed book, From Ideas to Action, Governance Past to Net Zero. I had the privilege of reading Professor Sarra's book in manuscript form, and I'm thrilled to be here for the much anticipated, long-awaited launch. From the perspective of institutional investors, which is the group that represented by the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance that I work with, Professor's book is an insightful and important contribution. The coalition's members manage collectively approximately $4.5 trillion in assets on behalf of beneficiaries and clients. And these assets comprise much of the retirement and other savings of many or most Canadians. As fiduciaries, they have a duty to protect and enhance the value of these assets. And the value of those assets is and will increasingly be impacted by climate change. Professor Sarra's book provides guidance to institutional investors on how to understand, respond to, and confront one, if not the most important issue, existential issue of our world. But Professor Sarra's book does much more than cover the implications of climate change for institutional investors. It's a comprehensive and erudite contribution to the study of the implications of climate change for all corporate actors, for corporations and all of their stakeholders. And importantly, it deals with how climate change impacts our world more broadly, with profoundly differential impacts on different populations. From Ideas to Action provides the strategies that need to be adopted to start addressing, mitigating, and adapting to climate change as it presents to various populations. Following Professor Sarra's introductory comments, which we'll get to shortly, our panelists today are going to focus on the relevance of different aspects of her work. And following the panelists' remarks, we will be answering questions from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function on your screen, and the question will be directed by me towards the person you request, or generally, if you don't have a particular person you want the question addressed to, then Professor Sarra and the panelists more generally. I will now very briefly introduce our panelists, because everyone has Google and they can find out more if they choose, before I give the floor over to Professor Sarra. First, we have Professor Cheryl Wade, who is the Dean Harold F. McNeese Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law in Queens, New York. Welcome, Cheryl. Next, we have Ravimbo Mutangudura, who is a corporate governance specialist at Assurance Canada. Welcome, Ravimbo. And finally, we have Dr. Carol Lau, who you've met already, who's an associate professor at law at the University of British Columbia and the director of UBC's Center for Business Law. So welcome. And I will now turn the floor over to Janis. And thank you, Janis. We wait very much to hear what you have to tell us about your new book.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you everyone for coming to the book launch. I'm delighted that 260 of you have registered. I'd like to echo Carol's thanks to our hosts and our funders. And I am also honored to work on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I also want to acknowledge the deep and sustained contributions that scientists have made to our knowledge about how our anthropogenic or human activities are contributing to global warming. 165 years ago, scientist Eunice Foote discovered that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and she was the first to link increasing emissions to heating up the planet. While her groundbreaking research was published in the American Journal of Science in 1856, her male colleague had to present her research to congresses of scientists because women were not allowed to speak. Fast forward to 2021, and our efforts to switch the trajectory of climate change are uneven at best. And globally, women still do not have equal voice in the corporate boardroom. When I started my research about 10 years ago, working with a group of scientists, David Archer made a lasting impression on me when his only speaking aid was a lump of coal. It was a powerful introduction to the different harms caused by different types of carbon emissions and the need to prioritize how we decarbonize. Back then, there was limited discussion about law's role. And in fact, I was asked numerous times what law had to do with climate change. So much has changed since then in terms of resources on law, finance, and climate change, but we're still not yet on track to stop its worst impacts. I frequently meet with company directors, pension trustees, and asset managers who are concerned about the increasingly devastating impacts of climate change. Many want to act, but are uncertain of where to get started or what their legal obligations are. This book offers them a guide. It's aimed at pulling together the best of the science, law, and governance practice, and the best of our aspirational goals for a sustainable planet. However, the book is not only for corporate directors and asset managers, but for all of us. Whether we think of ourselves or not, we are investors. We have savings that banks use in their lending. We contribute to private or public pension plans, which are some of Canada's and the world's largest institutional investors. And how these funds are invested will determine the future of our planet. So hopefully my book offers insights into what we should be asking of the individuals who have taken responsibility for managing our savings, our retirement funds, our investments, and our tax dollars. The book relies on corporate governance and finance theory, my passions, but it firmly embeds principles of fairness and equity in examining the legal and governance frameworks that should inform corporate decisions to manage climate change and to move us towards a net zero carbon economy. It draws on notions of fairness as justice as conceptualized by John Rawls and Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And in this respect, it tries to forge a path from ideas to climate action that makes room for a plurality of views on climate justice, and understanding that we may only have partial agreements on the best tools to deploy, but recognizes our common goal of protecting the planet and the future of humanity. It also builds on notions of intergenerational fairness drawn from pension law, Indigenous law, and biodiversity conservation norms. The book examines what drives corporate and investment decisions, highlighting strategies for engagement with companies, from investor meetings with corporate boards to proxy voting to divestment, as a continuum of tools to move recalcitrant actors. It examines in detail the legal obligations of directors, officers, and other investment fiduciaries to address climate change because there's still a gap in their understanding. It discusses lawsuits globally. There are more than 1,500 to date that are seeking to hold companies, pension funds, and governments accountable for their failure to act. And it also provides an optimistic global snapshot of innovative regulatory strategies, such as carbon pricing and green and blue taxonomies that encourage sustainable finance. Unfortunately, it no longer takes imagination to envision what a climate tipping point looks like. On the news every day now, we see loss of homes and businesses due to hurricanes, wildfire, and flooding, premature deaths from extreme heat waves, and commencement of massive migration necessitated by sea level rise and lack of water and arable land. But at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that governments can move rapidly and cooperatively when risks to life are urgent. Climate change is an urgent risk to life if the trajectory of emissions is not radically altered. We can learn a lot from the Global South and their efforts to decarbonize and from Indigenous traditional wisdom and stewardship of the planet. The book offers highlights of some fantastic examples of Indigenous sustainable finance models that are protecting biodiversity and generating economic returns with co-benefits to people and the planet. The Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative is an excellent example. Operating for 14 years, Coast Funds has generated $87 million in more than 350 economic development projects. But globally, we really need to scale up the voices of women and racialized community members at the policy table and in the corporate boardroom. And we need more full partnerships with Indigenous nations in financially sustainable projects. One of my chapters is dedicated towards moving towards a circular economy, which uses renewable energy, designs out waste for a cycle of reuse, ensures consumables are made of biological ingredients that can be safely returned to the biosphere, and durables, such as engines or computers, have their component parts designed from the start for reuse. And just to give you one example from the book, China's circular economy promotion law is requiring thousands of factories in China to embed themselves in eco-industrial parks. And Reda in Shandong province, for example, has virtually eliminated industrial waste. Its beer brewery's byproducts of vinasse is a raw input for a fertilizer factory. Its excess carbon dioxide is captured during production and used by another beverage company to carbonate soft drinks. Its pulp and paper plant uses scrap wood from one business, and in turn, its green mud is used for building materials and its white sludge for a cement plant. It fires the imagination as to all of us can rethink economic activity. There's also a chapter on micro, small, and medium businesses. They comprise 99% of all companies globally, and that percentage applies to Canada too, with over 1 million businesses. Micro and small and medium businesses play a pivotal role in stimulating economic growth, and they're instrumental in providing employment. Yet our frameworks to date have not recognized the barriers to effective climate action for smaller businesses and the need for infrastructure support. We can learn from the innovative strategies of the European Union and the Global South. And another example from the book, one of my favorites is Solar Sister in Africa. Carbon emissions and indoor smoke from solid fuels are responsible for 1.6 million deaths annually. And Solar Sister's network of 4,300 women entrepreneurs were trained and have delivered solar lighting and clean cook stoves to over 1.5 million people in hard to reach and often last mile communities. This renewable energy increases women's income and economic security and has made them agents of climate change mitigation. In 2018 alone, they helped over 15,000 families switch to clean cook stoves, which is the equivalent of the carbon sequestration of 600,000 trees growing for 10 years. So the book offers ideas on how to concurrently deploy legal governance, financial and normative tools to change behavior and hopefully encourage meaningful action in climate mitigation adaptation. These strategies are interlinked and they can be advanced within corporate decision-making structures. But key is that we shift the current trajectory in a way that is economically feasible, just, and fair. When I started working on climate change in the law, I was inspired to act because of my granddaughter, Amadea. I worry about the world we are leaving her. A decade later, I have 3 more granddaughters, which has only heightened my commitment to make all of us stewards of the earth. We owe it to ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Janis. That was an excellent and fascinating overview of your work, of your book. And I think would encourage people to want to get their hands on the book itself and learn more. I'm going to now turn to our panelists and ask Professor Wade to start by giving us your thoughts, Cheryl, on Professor Sarra's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and congratulations to you, Janis. Your very well-researched and eloquent book gives us everything we need to advocate for climate resilience. Janis gives us the language we need to convince leaders to take action, the specific steps that leaders must take, and the research and analysis that will inspire everyone who reads the book to engage with this important work. Janis discusses, as she just mentioned, the impact of climate change on women, Indigenous, and racialized communities. And my focus today will be on racialized communities in the US, particularly the African American community. My comments will address the challenges that African Americans face and how Janis's research can be used to address the problem for our community. I'll also consider the legal roadmap for inspiring action in the US in the context of fiduciary duty, which Janis also discusses in her book. Well, there's good news and there's bad news from the US. The good news is that Biden believes in science. His administration and Biden himself, they acknowledge that we in the US face 4 crises: COVID-19, like the rest of the world, economic insecurity, racial injustice, and climate change. But Biden is under a great deal of pressure, as you know, to avoid appearing as though he is too far to the left, that he's too progressive. And too many Americans, even if not a majority, do not believe in the science of climate change. They don't even believe in the science regarding COVID-19. They refuse to wear masks. They refuse to avoid travel. You know what's been happening in the US. My hope is that Biden will ignore that group. Now the bad news. Janis's book provides a comparative discussion of fiduciary duty of care analysis in several jurisdictions that will help to convince corporate boards to invest resources in climate preservation as part of their fulfillment of their duty of care. But duty of care analysis in the US would not be helpful in getting corporate boards to engage earnestly in climate preservation. In order for plaintiffs in the US to establish a duty of care breach, they have to show that defendant directors were grossly negligent or that they engaged in egregious conduct. This is an almost impossibly high burden for plaintiffs to meet. And if that burden is not met, the business judgment rule applies. The business judgment rule is a rule of judicial deference to the corporate board. It is a presumption on the part of the courts that the board has exercised its valid business judgment. Another problem in the US is that almost all states allow corporations to place exculpatory provisions in their charters. These provisions allow US firms to limit or completely eliminate liability for corporate directors who breach their duty of care. Also, in the US, the duty of care looks primarily to the board's process. This means that boards, in making decisions, will investigate the issue. They'll make a big show of it. They'll hire experts. They'll hold special meetings. They will provide business reasons for their decisions. They will attempt to show that they are informed about all of the material information reasonably available to them. And they will do this and be judged only on the process and not the substance of their decision. If the process looks okay, the business judgment rule applies regardless of substance. In other words, the process can be used to justify a board's conclusion to ignore climate preservation. All of this means that US cases in which directors have been held personally liable for duty of care breaches are extremely rare. So in the US, shareholders, and shareholders only, not stakeholders, may bring derivative suits for fiduciary duty breaches, but only the duty of loyalty remains useful in the US. Directors breach their duty of loyalty only if there's an unratified conflict of interest or if they behave in bad faith, and bad faith is defined as the intentional dereliction of duty or a conscious disregard for responsibilities. One could argue that the failure to undertake many of the steps that Janis describes in her book would be an intentional dereliction of a director's duty. But as I said, in the US, Fiduciary duties are owed to the corporation and to shareholders, not to stakeholders. So the argument would have to be that failure to take action is an intentional dereliction of a director's duty to protect the long-term sustainability of the corporation. In the long term, a company cannot survive if the company ignores climate preservation measures. That would be a duty of loyalty, fiduciary duty argument that would work in the US. So there may be workable fiduciary duty analysis. What does this mean for African Americans? The challenge for some African Americans, but clearly not all, is that climate change is an existential threat with disproportionately harsher and more frequent impact on African American communities. But there are other more imminent existential threats. Violence against African Americans committed by racist police officers, racism's impact on African American health, and the fact that this impact makes African Americans more vulnerable to COVID-19. And then there is the daily ordeal of dealing with 21st century economic exploitation of African Americans. The challenge is to get African American communities to engage in the effort to achieve climate resilience, even though we face so many other and more imminent threats. But Janis's book will inspire leaders in racialized communities in the US. And those leaders will inspire us all. We have to engage in climate change for our own survival. Everyone engaged in this work in this world, in the US, must look to African Americans to engage in the work. We want the US, of course, to come on board. And how do we do that? Why is this important? As you may know, in 2042, white Americans will no longer be in the majority. Most Americans will be of color. So African Americans must be recruited in climate preservation efforts because of our increasing political power. Just think of Stacey Abrams and her work to turn Republican Georgia blue. Janis's work provides leaders of color with the information and the inspiration they need to get communities of color on board, to mobilize them. And I think that the focus should be on working, middle class, and affluent African Americans. This is a large group that makes up the majority of the African American population. These African Americans have sufficient resources. We can buy shares in companies and engage in the proxy process. We can draft shareholder proposals. And Janis's book provides a roadmap with clear instructions for the content of those proposals. Janis's book gives shareholder activists a roadmap for their activism. Yesterday, we in the US celebrated the anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther King. In one of his speeches to an almost all Black audience, Dr. King said, "This will be a great America. We will be the participants in making it so." So I thank you, Janis, for this important book, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was very fascinating and wonderful synopsis of the situation in the US and possible ways forward, which we all want to hear. Next, I'll be turning to Ravimbo. Would you like to share with us your thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Janis, for the honor to be a part of this panel. I think there were so many key takeaways from this book. It's difficult to focus on just a couple.
You're on mute, Ravimbo.
Is this better now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay,
Thanks.
all
Yeah.
right.
Great.
Thank you, Catherine. I was saying thank you so much, Janis, for the honor to be a part of this panel discussion. There were so many key takeaways from this book, and it's hard to focus on just a couple in the short amount of time that I have, but I'll do my best to just elaborate on some of the things that really hit home for me. So I'm kind of working backwards from the book, something that you said at the end in your conclusion, Janis, and also picked up again as you were giving your introductory thoughts on how you got involved in this work due to your commitment to leave the world a better place for your granddaughters. And I find that it's easy to get caught up and lost in the macro level, institutional aspect of this conversation. You know, we're talking about institutional investors, corporate directors, etc., that it can make this topic a little bit out of reach and almost feel like, what can I do about this issue? But you did such an excellent job of bridging the micro and the macro levels on how we can achieve effective climate governance. And I believe before there can be corporations or institutions or board of directors, they're fundamentally people. And it's our actions as people within these institutions as it relates to climate change in this situation that brings about, you know, systemic, whether it's risks or harms, or on the more positive side, systemic change. And usually this harm or risk disproportionately affects, like Cheryl said as well, Indigenous folks, racialized folks, women, the global South. And I find that when it's put in these terms, the human terms, it's undeniable that corporate directors and officers have a moral obligation to enhance their governance structures to facilitate a transition to a net zero carbon emission world and have sustainable activities in their organizations and corporations. And I find that even as I was reading the book, for folks that might think more rigidly in financial terms, I'm a liberal arts graduate, so I think more in the social science framework first. I still find that even those financial risks and implications of climate change, Janis clearly outlined them in this book. And a lot of them have already began to materialize. As you can see, market preferences are definitely beginning to shift. And you know, if you companies and organizations that are refusing to adapt and to go along with that shift to more sustainable investment opportunities are going to get left behind. Or on the other hand, like she explains in chapter 7, face some sort of legal actions as she went in depth about climate litigation and that being on the rise. So the fact that directors and officers can be personally found liable for failing to monitor corporate risk and sustainability is again an indication of how either way you spin it, there will be a financial cost to pay. The decision is just now or later. And I would opt for now. It's better to pay or I guess take on that financial risk or the financial cost of switching and adapting to more sustainable investment and more sustainable business models now, as opposed to bankruptcy or the legal cost that will come along with the litigation. And I think there's something to be said about using this pivotal moment that we're at to, as Janis puts it in the book, nurture new norms and institutionalize a new set of moral principles. I remember in undergrad taking a course in international justice and coming across the principles of John Rawls, which I thought was fascinating, his idea of the original position, the veil of ignorance. And of course, the theory itself is not without critiques, but I do think it makes good sense, especially in this climate change scenario. If anything, this might be one of the best scenarios to apply the theory. We're all affected by climate change. That's a fact. And I'm glad that there is a lot less climate deniers now than there were even a couple of years ago. But the way that climate change shows up in our lives might be different. Some are actively facing droughts or floods, like Janis mentioned. Others, it might be a decrease in air quality or even just overall quality of life. But we definitely feel it. And because we don't know what the exact impacts of the climate change will be in 20, 30, 40 years from now, even though I might have comfort in the fact that I live in Toronto and I'm not seeing anything as tangible as people who are living elsewhere, I have no guarantee that that will remain the case always. And as we're moving towards this tipping point, this idea of the tipping point where we'll reach irreversible effects, I think it's important to really put climate governance on the forefront. And it should seek, as we're developing it, to treat everyone with equal concern. So look at those that are disproportionately affected and ascertain if those principles that we're developing are also going to serve them, rather than simply in the global West. These principles should be fair to all, even the least in the system. And on this topic of developing countries as well, which I have a vested interest in, being from a developing country myself, I think this book holds valuable lessons, and in fact could serve as a blueprint that corporate directors and offices should start implementing in order to move towards effective climate governance in the global south. Over the weekend, I had a conversation with my mother, who is a corporate secretary at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Zimbabwe. And she's told me that there's particular attention being paid to issues of corporate governance more generally, but the climate issue is still lacking. And yes, although carbon emissions are not as high as in developed countries, developing countries are still in the process of developing, and it's important that they set that trajectory of sustainable development now, as opposed to waiting until their development becomes more heavily fossil fuel dependent. There's no reason why we should be having this conversation 20 years from now, only talking about developing countries. And at several points in the book, Janis mentions the responsibility of major emitters and more developed countries and regions to help these developing countries and regions along in sustainable development. And I find that there's a really big opportunity, in fact, to create a symbiotic relationship that aids in the development of developing countries by having those regions supply metals and minerals such as copper, platinum, manganese, that support that move to a low carbon world. And so you can really see how it can be a win-win situation if we decide to act on this issue together. Which leads me finally to the importance, like Janis said, of diversity and having people at the table who can contribute to climate-related policymaking and implementation. Again, she mentioned women, indigenous folks, people with local knowledge and have been living in a harmonious relationship with this planet for centuries. They can add valuable insight as we move to try and implement effective climate governance policies. And it's important that they're properly represented at the tables where these decisions are being made. So again, to echo Cheryl's thoughts, Janis, thank you so much for this amazing body of work that is truly going to make an impact to moving to a net zero carbon world.
Thank you very much, Ravimba, for those persuasive and optimistic comments. Very much appreciate those. Next, we're going to move to Carol and ask for Carol's views on yet another aspect of Janis's work. Carol?
Thank you, Catherine. So in my short time today, I also want to talk a bit about the significance of this book. And I think that in order for me to adequately do that, I also need to have you understand the kind of scholar that Janis Sarra is. For anyone who knows her, you know that she's a doer. She has never shied away from complex problems or the very hard work that comes in helping to actually solve those problems. And in her wide-ranging levels of expertise across business, insolvency, corporate finance, securities law, we are very lucky that combating climate change is Janis's passion, and this book is doing a number of things that I want to highlight. So we all hopefully know at this point that climate change is an urgent and existential threat to humanity. And as Janis notes in her book, the current climate mitigation plans across the vast majority of countries around the world aren't sufficient in reversing the trajectory of climate change and preventing the most devastating effects of global warming. It is a wicked problem. And sometimes it can feel so big that we almost want it to fade into the backdrop and put off dealing with it for another day. But those in power, though, cannot do this. And as a public educator, Janis is also a bridge builder, because there are many ways to convey the direness of the challenges we face. It is important to expose and examine, and it is also important to provide guidance on how to move forward. And to have the depth of knowledge that she does on climate change, on the ever-evolving legal and regulatory frameworks across nations, and on the detailed nuances of effective climate governance across industries. It takes a level of commitment that many of us would struggle with. And in those ways, Janis is a true scholar and activist. And what you have in this book is her wealth of knowledge curated into a very clear call to action for directors and officers, for pension fiduciaries, investors, our governments, and our institutions. because too often in our past, we have separated economics and ecology. We have separated business and the environment. And now it's come to a very uncomfortable reckoning. Climate change is a transdisciplinary issue, and Janis is a transdisciplinary scholar. And to address this existential threat, those of us in business need to adequately understand what the science actually says and how we are contributing to climate change and how we must drastically alter the status quo. You know, it isn't enough to say, yes, climate change sounds bad and well, it's complicated. Janis's role as an educator and as a bridge builder in this book has closed the door on any more excuses for corporate and governmental inaction. She lays out systematically and in very clear terms the science and the reasons why we all need to care and how we can move forward, saying, I am here to provide you with the tools you need. And she is speaking to those holding the power to say, you can't say you don't know anymore. It is a primer on the fundamentals and fills this seemingly this knowledge gap that we have between the climate science and the governance of our institutions to get to where we all need to go, which is to a net zero carbon economy as soon as possible. Interwoven within this book are principles that I know are near and dear to Janis's heart, which are principles of fairness and equity. Many of you may not know this, but Janis is famous for her transdisciplinary conferences. I remember attending one of her conferences on fairness over 10 years ago when I was a doctoral student and she was the director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. And I remember seeing the violin quartet from the UBC Faculty of Music that was on stage playing a song that had been composed on fairness, which she had commissioned as part of the conference. And I also remember her interpretive dance conferences at Bowen Island, which I always politely declined. I think I used my young babies as an excuse at the time. But it was then that I knew how ingrained this concept of interdisciplinarity, fairness, equity, and inclusion embodies her work. So her book points out at the get-go that we have all been slow to acknowledge how the impact of climate change disproportionately harms Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, and women. And as you heard from Ravimbo, in no uncertain terms, Janis's book recognizes how people in the global South and Indigenous communities are suffering the most from the current impacts of climate change, even though they are not responsible for most of the carbon emissions generated since the Industrial Revolution. So using an intersectional lens on gender and race and also principles of fairness and equity, Janis addresses the legal and regulatory tools, including oversight, disclosure, carbon taxing, sustainable finance, and also the realities of emerging litigation using comparative jurisdictional analysis, which along with her how-to guide on fiduciary duties and effective climate governance for boards, emphasizes this need for accountability. She notes how individuals, companies, and countries that have benefited the most historically and contributed the most to our climate problem should bear greater responsibility. And Indigenous peoples and other historically marginalized groups need to have their voice in the decision-making processes, and those in power must recognize and act upon this. So the thoroughness and thoughtfulness in her candor and patient determination to make that clear-cut, obvious case for boards and institutions to pay attention and act, it resonates throughout her book. And I want to make 3 quick last points in my time. First, picking up on how I started by saying that Janis is a doer. Her research on this book predates the Canada Climate Law Initiative, which she co-leads. And her book, being called From Ideas to Action, is so appropriate as I've watched how much she believes that through the initiative as she has corralled experts from across Canada to help deliver training on effective climate governance. You know, she's not that scholar that pontificates from up high. She's in those rooms where it happens. She's moving policy forward, finding the power levers in our society and pointing them to the research and reforms necessary to strengthen climate resilience across sectors. You know, she commissions leading lawyers in Canada to provide legal opinions on fiduciary duties that have national impact. She writes op-eds in every news outlet she can get her hands on. She provides details, notes, and slides so that others can present and do the same. So this book is really a culmination of all her efforts and that thought power behind her ongoing work with the Canada Climate Law Initiative and her pursuit of a sustainable future for her granddaughters. So I want to note how this book is emblematic of the broader engine of work she is pursuing to get us to net zero. Second point, Janis notices how women are, she notes this in her book, how women are only infrequently at national and international decision-making tables, and racialized women are even more excluded from policymaking. It isn't lost on me how Janis has attained her stature within a very male-dominated field and started her academic career after a very successful professional one at a time when the dominant discussion in corporate law was if corporations were even allowed to consider the environment. She has carved her own path, and I know she had to work double as hard to help clear a path for those of us following after her. And it gives me unending pride to see her successes as a change maker that is shifting the corporate legal landscape. And having her knowledge on this topic put into a monograph is a gift. And lastly, my last point, we know that climate change differs because of the systematic and interconnected risks that act as a risk multiplier. And with this pandemic, our world is going to be defined now as the time before and the time after. And many of the root causes of climate change also increase the risk of pandemics. You know, we've got deforestation, loss of habitat, forcing animal migration, which increases infectious disease risks. And Janis notes in her last chapter how the pandemic is an unexpected catastrophe, whereas climate change is an expected one. And we are at a critically important moment in history on so many levels, and how we choose to recover from this pandemic and from Trump, you know, where we seek to establish a social foundation where humanity can thrive while operating within our planetary boundaries. You know, this is, as my dear friend, Professor Beata Schaafgel says, it's the greatest challenge of our time. So I hope this book serves as an important catalyst to help us here in Canada get another step closer to net zero as we live under this climate emergency. And so, you know, congratulations, Janis, on this book, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I especially appreciate your characterization of Janis as an educator, an activist, and a scholar. All of those things, they're very, very true. We're going to now turn to questions from the audience. I wanted to let the audience know that there will be a recording available, because this was one of the questions about whether people will be able to have access to this later. I'm not sure when, but we will be sending out an email, I think, to that effect, to let people that are participating know when it will be available. So I'm going to start with one of the questions that's directed to all, actually. And I maybe start with you, Janis. What are your views on the relationship between government action and private decision-making in making progress on combating climate change? Good question.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I think there's a very close connection in a number of ways, and I'm sure others will add to this. From my perspective, from a business perspective particularly, governments need to send clear, consistent messages to business about their expectations for decarbonization. Whatever the mechanisms are, carbon pricing, you know, scaling up their disclosure requirements, et cetera, there needs to be clear and consistent messages. And one of the issues in Canada, of course, is that there are inconsistent messages across the country. And when you talk to companies and you talk to pension funds, they say it doesn't help. Is that really we need to pull together? And that's partly my reference. We may not all agree on every facet of the policy choice, but people want to actually understand what it is and ensure that it's consistent so they can put in place climate action plans, risk management plans that are consistent and forward-looking. And then from the side of the companies themselves, I think they have an obligation in terms of working with governments. In the book, I talk about actually company engagement with policy decision-making as another form of engagement. In other words, for the companies, and there are many in Canada who are supporting the transition to net zero, they need to make those messages loud and clear to their policymakers. But they also need to do exactly what Ruvimbo and Carol and Cheryl have said, which is they need to say to policymakers, you need to open up the scope of voices. So we're speaking, but you need to listen to other voices in Canada, internationally, and international policy tables, because that's how we're going to get at something that's more comprehensive, more forward-looking, and really does enable us to have the creativity to really think innovatively. And the examples in the book are really inspiring in terms of how people are actually making real this idea of decarbonizing, of a circular economy, and of really shifting the distribution, I guess, of benefits and wealth as we do it. So I'll let others answer too.
Okay.
I'll just
Anybody
jump in to say that the best example of the tragedy of inconsistent messages is exactly what's happening in another context here in the US with respect to the pandemic. And so it's an excellent question. And I think that the connection and the collaboration between the public and the private sector is absolutely essential in these life-threatening tragedies that we're experiencing. The governments can't do it alone. Companies cannot do it alone.
Would anyone else, like Carol or Ruvimbo, would you like to comment?
I think I'll just say,
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly on Cheryl's point, the book has a lot of examples as well of citizen engagement and how even from a grassroots level, citizens can have, that collective voice that pushes government to act and policymakers to act as well. And so very much like Cheryl said, them working together, governments and I guess, on the private side as well, it needs to be a collaborative effort if we're going to be able to actually tackle this problem that's affecting all of us, regardless of your hierarchy or where you're located globally even. So I would say take hold, especially if it seems a lot overwhelming. Take a hold of that citizen engagement and the increase in the injustice and climate justice that's on the rise around the world as well.
I'll just add by saying, with a very multifaceted problem requires multifaceted solutions, and there's not going to be one grand, solution. It's a jigsaw puzzle, really, of sustainability. And, the one thing that I think is really important, you've got your incentive, you've got your carrots, but you've also got your sticks. And Janis has dedicated a chapter to talking about litigation. And there may just be a point where if it's not going fast enough, it is that stick that I think might need to resonate. And that is in a way allowing for other voices, so long as there's access to justice, to be able to make them heard if they're not heard in other ways. But again, it's individual and concerted efforts that are all needed across particular industries. So in a way, it's pick your piece, right, and move that forward. And hopefully we are able to get there in that sense. But sometimes it just all contributes to that trajectory. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, your comment about the stick is a good segue into the next question that we have, which is specifically directed at you, Cheryl. It's quite long. I'm going to read it. Is there a way to use the duty of loyalty to create liability exposure for U.S. corporate directors through cases brought by passive long-term institutional investors like pension funds with intergenerational obligations that reference Delaware court opinions, which say that directors have duties to manage corporations outside the sale of the company in the interest of long-term shareholders who provide permanent capital?
That is a long question.
It's a long question.
Absolutely. My answer is yes. The duty of care won't help in the US, but the duty of loyalty, which will impose liability on boards if they consciously disregard responsibilities, is what institutional investors can address with the board. That the long-term interests of the investors, the long-term interests of the company are at stake. Focusing on the community, companies give a lot of lip service on stakeholders in the US. It's not a requirement. We're not like the Netherlands, as I learned from Janis's book, which says that shareholders do not take any, they don't enjoy primacy over stakeholders. We're so far from that in the US, but I think there is a very good argument that focuses on the long-term interests of the company and the long-term interests of shareholders who are investing for who are investing for the long term, who are not speculating, who are not trading, buying and selling.
If I can
Sure.
jump in, Catherine, I think Cheryl's really answered that question well, but I wanted to make one other comment about the US litigation, because there are literally almost 500 cases pending in the US right now. And one other area that directors and officers should be very attuned to in the United States, or for Canadian companies doing business in the United States, is that states' attorney generals, municipal and regional governments have become very involved. And there are a huge number of tort liability suits now, nuisance, going after major carbon emitting companies for their contributions percentage-wise to climate change. And whereas the early cases on this failed because of causation and some other federal US policies, they're now gaining traction, and they're surviving initial challenges to dismiss them. And the science on attrition is now so fine-tuned. There are facilities out of Oxford University, of which CCLI is affiliated with, that can actually calculate now the precise carbon emissions of a factory, et cetera, in a community. And so these are just going to gain more and more traction. And if people think they're long shots, they need only think about the kinds of huge settlements out of the asbestos cases and the huge settlements out of the tobacco cases. So once you get states' attorneys involved, and then they start to work with institutional investors, there's a big payday coming, unless companies can really shift trajectory in a very fundamental way. Thank you.
Thank you, Janis. And does anybody else have any comments on the question? No? Okay, we have another one here. This is a bit of a shift back towards the shareholder perspective. And this is, I'll start with you, Janis. Does your book speak to shareholder interests in returns on investment, and how issues of climate change would therefore have to reach shareholders to allow boards to feel comfortable in investing their interest in supporting climate change concerns?
That's a really good question. I could give a 5-hour lecture on that at this moment, but I think the short answer is obviously the board is elected by shareholders, and so therefore they have to be attuned to shareholders as one of the inputs in their decision making. But the reality is that directors rarely have a binary decision. Mitigate climate change versus make profit. And in fact, there have been a growing number of meta studies, which means studies of the studies. So there's one that studied returns on ESG, environmental, social, and governance investments for over 2,000 studies that found that in fact, companies that are highly attuned and investors that are highly attuned to ESG, including climate risk management, actually have consistently equal or better returns. There's also been at least 3 reports since COVID started to talk about the fact that the sustainability indexes are outperforming during COVID consistently month over month and all of last year. And so I think there's a case to be made to shareholders that never have an interest been so aligned between community members, other stakeholders, pension beneficiaries, and shareholders. And we have to keep that in mind. But equally, I would say, hopefully the book makes a message that sometimes the very short-term wealth maximization has to give way to thinking about sustainable investment and how we are planning for the future. And so that, I hope, is an important message that also comes out in the book.
Yeah, thank you. Switching gears again to more practical, this question is asked, and I think this is one that I can direct to anybody on the panel and Janis. If you had to give practical advice to small and mid-cap companies, what would it be besides reading your guide, Janis, on audit committees navigating climate change? Any advice for small and mid-cap companies that want to approach this?
Carol, you look like you were going to start. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Janis, you have a whole chapter dedicated to micro, small, and mid-sized firms, so certainly you should be commenting.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I think there are lots of clues in there and lots of lessons to learn, but I think it is a situation where we need to make sure that some of our what we call quasi-public institutions like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank need to recognize some of the obstacles. So I'm a big fan of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I'm a huge fan on their structure of governance, strategy, risk management, and targets and metrics. But I do think we need to translate some of the more complex models being adopted by very large companies and large investors down to the family business size, the micro family business size. And we need to think about what tools we can provide and funding or infrastructure support so that small businesses and family businesses that really want to do this conversion, what are the tips for them to start tomorrow? And hopefully the book offers some of those ideas, but I do think this is one of the next big areas where we need to really turn our minds to.
Thank you for that. A question for Cheryl. What is the first tangible step to enlist African Americans in climate preservation efforts?
I think the first step is to get community leaders involved, whether they're leaders of sororities, fraternities, not-for-profits, the clergy. The leaders have to be informed. The leaders should be reading Janis's book. And they need to be educated about, not just about the details of climate change and what could happen or climate preservation, but they need to be educated about the urgency of the problem. And I think that they can play a very significant role in encouraging the community to engage in very meaningful discourse in this regard. Now, puzzlingly, this is how African Americans were targeted for predatory subprime mortgages. Lenders went to community leaders, they went to church leaders and convinced the leaders that this was a good idea. So there will be some level of distrust here, but I think this is a completely different situation in that we all have skin in this game. We're all at risk here. And I think that it has to begin with engaging the community in sustained, meaningful discourse. It has to be on the list of things that we talk about as a community. And not at the end of the list, but we have a list of things we talk about as families, as friends, as churches, as organizations, and this has to be part of that list.
I could also just echo Cheryl's sentiments and say that applies as well, even in the global South. I think in the couple of conversations that I've had with people on the African continent specifically, climate change really is not showing up. So although they're seeing the physical effects of it, there still hasn't been that cognitive shift to see that this is something that we should actually be putting on the table and prioritizing. And granted, there are other things that might be said to be immediately pressing in communities, racialized communities in the global South, but this is very much, as Janis illustrates in the book, it's a catastrophe that is waiting to happen that we can see right now. And so people definitely do need to be engaged from a community level.
I want to read, there's a long question here, the long introduction, but I think it's a very good question. So I will read it. Through a combination of economic development, increased agriculture, medical advancement, etc., The world's population has transformed over the past 2,000 years by a factor of 25 to almost 10 billion. The first time it reached 1 billion was some 200 years ago. Unfortunately, on a group basis, possibly the main benefit of increasing a nation's population is to provide a larger army. On the other hand, children are our greatest treasure in life. I appreciate that generally as families, nations become more wealthy, the birth rate goes down. The question is whether this trend is enough, and can there be sufficient inducement for those in underprivileged nations to avoid a new population crisis? And the questioner comments, there are no easy answers to these thorny questions. Does anybody want to take a stab at that large issue? No.
I mean, I think it's a very important question, but I think it's a very large question, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that we're at our time. But I think that definitely population planning is very much part of the puzzle, just as economic disparity is, just as climate risk is. And so I think I can only thank the questioner for bringing it to our attention, but I think it's really, I mean, unless someone else wants to answer, it is a very big, complex question that I think has to be part of the puzzle we work through as we go forward.
Anybody else want to take a bite out of that? No? Okay. I think I have one final question before, if I just can find this here. This is a more granular, a couple of granular governance questions. Large institutional investors have been advocating term limits for directors. 10 years is short in the context of climate change. How do you make sure that those types of limits go against ensuring a director adopting a long-term view? So we have a very governance question here.
So there's a bit. So for me, the big question about terms for directors is twofold. The first is you want directors to be on a board for long enough that they have the wisdom and experience that they can actually be consistently applying what the decisions of the company are. And so climate risk mitigation is a good example of that. On the other hand, you also want board renewal, and we're also in a time where we definitely want to have attention to the fact that we need more diversity on corporate boards and on the boards of institutional investors. So we need renewal and we need new ideas. When terms are too long, you have something that's called groupthink, and where everybody starts to think alike, and the people that used to challenge one another to find the best decision start to think alike and start to forget about perhaps multiple other kinds of stakeholders. So it's finding the right balance, but I will say whether the term is 6 years, 8 years, or 10 years, what's critical is the board has a duty, frankly, to continue to educate itself, to continue to hear from professionals who are thinking about issues relating to climate risk mitigation, to think about how what their decisions are doing impact the long-term sustainability of the business. And so you need to link board terms and the continuation of experience with that. But even where you have turnover on a sort of a rotating basis, it's incumbent on the pre-boards, the directors that are on the board and are leaving, to impart some of that history, that collective history and that wisdom to the incoming directors. And I think that's just really the basis of good, effective governance.
Thank you, Janis. We have a couple more great questions, but I think we're running out of time. So I wanted to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you especially to Janis. This has been a fascinating conversation. And we appreciate your insights. And in closing, Janis had asked that the audience that you consider supporting a visual conversation by African art students on climate resilience and hope for a green recovery. Proceeds from sale of their art is supporting them in the South African Vulnerable Artist Fund. The link is posted in you'll see it in the Q&A box. So I want to thank everyone for attending today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all.